is really happening is that the American dream is on life support. That old idea that if you work hard and if you play by the rules, your kids will get a chance to do a little better than you is fundamentally under threat. Every American wants their kids to have more choices than they've had. Choice of where to live, what job to do, who to marry. But at the end of the day, that American dream, that is the idea that everyone should have the power to decide for themselves, is very close to dying. Now, my parents certainly wanted this for me, as I imagine any of you who are our parents in the crowd want for your kids, or your parents in turn wanted for you. I grew up in a little town, North Carolina. It's called Hickory. It's at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains. And my dad was a traveling paper salesman. My mom was a public school teacher. I was an only child. We were pretty much as whatever you think of when you think of a small town, stereotypical family, we were. We went to church every single Sunday. We walked there. We came back on Sunday afternoons. We hung out with my grandparents, had fried chicken and biscuits if we were lucky, and played baseball in the backyard. My parents both did well economically. They did better than their parents, who had been mill workers and country club groundskeepers in my dad's case. But the economic security that they were able to achieve gave them a freedom to choose who they wanted to be, and they hoped that pattern would continue for me, for their son. And on first blush, it looks like my story is reflective of that big old American dream idea. I got financial aid and left Hickory when I was 14. I got a chance to go to Harvard after that. I got financial aid to go to a boarding school, and then I got a chance to go to Harvard on another scholarship afterward. And while I was there, I roomed with Mark Zuckerberg. Some of you may know who he is, I think. We started Facebook our sophomore year, and it exploded. And for 3 years worth of work on the communications, marketing, and product teams, I earned nearly $500 million before I was 30 years old. And I'm up here to tell you that that's not exactly how the American dream is supposed to work. That's not up by your bootstraps kind of ingenuity. There's nothing that you can call that but what it is, a lucky break. Now, my story is part of a collection of stories that create an illusion of economic opportunity in this country that simply does not exist. What's really happening is that poor and middle-class families in the United States are losing power year after year, while a select few are getting very lucky. And it's not the luck that's like the luck of winning the lottery. That's the problem with the word luck sometimes. What's really happening is a small group of people have made very specific decisions that have configured the economy so that a small number of people get historically wealthy, and our largest corporations are larger than they've ever been, while everybody else, working people, have a harder and harder time making ends meet. The stats show that this is true. Some of you are familiar with many of these, but I'll just cite one or two. The median household income of Americans has barely budged in the past 40 years, while the cost of living is up by 30%. The top 0.1% in our country now controls as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. Not the top 1%, the top 0.1%. And that level, it has not been that bad since 1929, the year the Great Depression began. Meanwhile, small business starts, a metric that suggests an overall rate of entrepreneurship, are also at all-time lows. Americans are moving far less often now than they have ever before. The cost of housing in our cities is skyrocketing, and the cost of higher education and childcare is significantly higher. It's not just economic power that ordinary Americans are losing. It's power in our politics, too. The flood of money and special interest means elected officials spend as much time dialing for dollars, calling people like me and many of you, instead of spending time with constituents. At the same time, Americans are losing ground when it comes to the power of the purse. Our cities have been gutted so that now, instead of a small town street with lots of small businesses, you've got Walmart and Target. And ironically, the larger and larger these things get, corporate consolidation and the growth of monopoly power has meant that profits are at record highs, but consumers have less things to choose from. Their power is increasingly constrained. And some groups, it's important to say, are more disempowered than others. In 2016, white families had a median net worth of $170,000, compared with $17,000 for African American families and $20,000 for Hispanic ones. On average, a woman still earns 81 cents for every dollar a man earns, and women's median annual earnings are over $10,000 less than men's. Now, for fear that I have painted too bleak of a picture, of course there are bright shoots. Everybody has an iPhone, can all binge watch Netflix. There are indeed more farmers markets than there were a decade ago. But these advances are window dressing for the underlying problem that is clear. Middle class and poor Americans are standing in a proverbial line that isn't moving, and they are getting restless. I also want to submit to you today that there is actually a lot that we can do. And there's a long list that probably many of you are familiar with. Things like more aggressive enforcement of monopoly power, campaign finance reform, universal child care, a government healthcare system for every American, streamlined licensing requirements, better city planning. There are many, many things that we can and should talk about today. But I want to suggest that the most powerful way to rebalance power in our country is also the simplest: cash money. By definition, money is the most liquid, most fungible source of power. It enables an individual to decide what she wants on her own terms. It's not power per se. You need to have an option set of choices to choose from and the skills to think through what you need. But in a world like the one we live in today, cash is the most powerful lever that we have to pull to help the Americans who need it most. And I'm here to make the case that we should use unconditional cash to eradicate poverty in the United States once and for all, and create economic opportunity for a middle class that it currently experiences a stagnated economic situation. A guaranteed income would provide every single American a foundation of economic security in these troubled times. It could take a lot of different forms. A lot of people talk about a UBI these days, which is often talked about in the context of the rise of the robots and $1,000 for everyone. Another idea is to modernize our tax code and create a negative income tax that uses government to provide a cash transfer of $500 a month to the middle on down, to everybody making $50,000 or less. This is what I discuss at length in a book that I published a few months ago called Fair Shot. Another approach might be to create a universal dividend funded by a tax on carbon or even on data that provide a payment every single month or every single year to every American, pattern off of what we already do up in Alaska. But in whatever direction we take, the end result should be clear. Something like an extra $500 a month with no strings attached in the pockets of the people who need it most would re-energize the American dream. This is an old idea that's been supported by everybody from Milton Friedman to Martin Luther King Jr. to Richard Nixon. And it's an idea that is getting a lot of attention today because of concerns about the end of work or the future of work. But I'm here today to say that we don't need to know whether or not the robots are actually going to take the jobs. It's a fun debate to have, but wherever you fall on it, we already know that work is coming apart in America, that income inequality has not been this bad in nearly a century, and that cash is the most effective way to combat it. How to do this and who the leaders of this future movement might be are a big question that I and several of my colleagues here today work on every day. But I want to introduce you to one woman who's an incredible community organizer. Her name is Aisha Nyandoro, and she's about to launch a guaranteed income pilot for single African American mothers in Jackson, Mississippi, the poorest state in our nation. Let's cue the video.
I don't think we realize that our future is really determined by what we're exposed to and what we're allowed to dream about. I knew growing up exactly what I wanted to do when I became an adult. I knew I wanted to run a nonprofit. I knew I wanted to work in the community. That's because my grandmother was an activist. That's because my mother and all of my aunties are social workers. So that was my level of exposure. Living in poverty, if you do not have people feeding into you what your future can be, that's why we have these generations of poverty that exist.
I don't know what Aisha saw in me to even offer me the opportunity that she did, but I'm so thankful. Will you make it to the class today? We want you to get a certificate of completion. Don't make me have to come to 16D, ma'am.
We talk about there being a lack of leadership in these communities, and I don't think it's a lack of leadership. I think people are exhausted, and I think their bandwidth is taxed. But if I have my bandwidth freed up and I actually have the ability to think and breathe and dream, I think some of the leadership that is just naturally in these communities will begin to manifest again.
Prior to my job, I really didn't think that far ahead. I just worried about what was right now. I'm going to school for social work. I know that's what my calling is now, and that's because of my job. I want to be able to do it on my own. My reality is I can't. I'm not ashamed to say that I need help. I am here to help other people, but I'ma still need help.
If we just look at the number of folks who live in poverty in this country, the majority of them are women and their kids. And so having that ability to lift women out of poverty would be great. I think basic income could help in so many instances. Giving someone monthly cash would instill a sense of breathing room. I think it should be unconditional. I think we should trust people to know what it is that they need. I think having a basic income could really help transform communities across this country because local leadership would begin to show back up and flourish.
If I can get one person to listen and to hear, I feel like I did something for that day. If I can get two, I'm overwhelmed. I'm kicking my heels up.
Folks with limited income are just like you and I. They have the same dreams that we have. They want their kids to go to college. They want their kids to have bright futures. They want grandbabies. They want the white picket fence. They want the opportunity to take vacations. They want the same thing that we want. We're not different, and that's the piece that I really think we have all got to get to. Their dreams that I have for my son are exactly the same dreams that they have for their families.
Aisha speaks truth to power every day when she makes the case that the women she serves need your trust and respect. I went to Jackson in February and sat down with a dozen of the women that Aisha works to help every day. And every single woman had a story of resilience and fortitude to tell. They also, every single one, had story after story about shuttling from one government office to another to prove their need. These women are smart, ambitious, resourceful, and today they spend the bulk of their time navigating government bureaucracy rather than empowering them with the cash they need. And Aisha isn't just interested in cash because it's empowering. She, like many of us, have read all of the reports, all of the studies that document the empirical case for cash. She doesn't make the case based off of her gut, but on the 200+ studies that have been done across the globe and here at home that document the power of cash transfers. Here in the US alone, we know that when you provide people with modest amounts of cash consistently, hospitalization rates go down. Kids stay in school longer. They do better on tests. Rates of alcoholism and mental health issues decrease. Prime-age adults continue to work just as much as before, if not a little bit more. And maybe most importantly, people are able to live one step back from the financial brink. Now, despite the evidence, I'm sure that many people, even in this room, are still a little uncomfortable with the idea of just giving people money. Because it's easier to make the case for investments in education, skills training, these kinds of things, because it keeps power with the elites who design these programs, with the people who can tell the poor where to go and how to live their lives. But we have been investing for decades hundreds of billions of dollars in better educational opportunities, and economic mobility in the United States has gotten worse, not better. Of course we need good schools. There is no question of that. We, of course, need job skills and training programs. But the question is whether we begin to acknowledge that the only way that people can take advantage of those schools, can take advantage of those programs, is if they have the gas money to get there, the money for childcare, the money to ensure that they and their kids are healthy enough and not hungry when they show up to class. This will require nothing but a sea change in the way that we think about class and power in America. We have to adopt a sharper, less polite tone about what's happening in our country that names the imbalance of power that exists and focuses more attention on it. We'll have to have a broader conversation about all of the interventions we need, and we have to challenge ourselves to rebalance the scale. Let me close by saying there are few examples in history where the concentration of power is given up willingly or even charitably. People have to organize to do something about it. And that work is beginning today. I co-chair one group, along with Natalie Foster, who's here in the crowd today, called the Economic Security Project, where we fund things like the pilots of cash-based programs, further research into the idea, and lots of entrepreneurs who are thinking about ways to create programs in their own communities. We're just getting started, and we welcome and need more fellow travelers like Aisha on the journey, because there is so much work ahead. But if we're successful, even in a really small way, not only will we have provided a little bit more cash to the people who need it most, hopefully we will have tilted the scales just that little bit more toward the power that we believe working Americans need and deserve. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please keep your seats for a spoken word.